A few months ago, actually, we received a call from the Third Mind Foundation inviting us to be international jurors for a competition across the world to design Donald Trump's new border wall. And obviously we declined the offer, mainly after we read the final part of their brief, which, this is what I was fearing, the changing of the slides. After we read the brief that said, let us be clear, this is the curators of the competition, let us be clear, we take no position on this issue. We remain politically neutral. And this is what Fonna and I actually see as one of the greatest problems with institutions today, the refusal to call the problem by its name. To remain politically neutral in the context of today's social and economic crisis is to be, in fact, complicit with the institutions that have perpetuated what is ethically and morally wrong. We believe that today, architects, cultural producers, more than ever, we need to take a position to vehemently say that inequality is wrong, that xenophobia is wrong, and that building border walls is wrong. Many times we think that this incapacity of our creative fields to think socially and politically today is a byproduct of many decades that have been dominated by antisocial, anti-public agendas that have in fact exerted a violent blow to our collective social, environmental, and economic assets. And as all of us know, I hope, have created incredible urban asymmetry and unprecedented social and economic inequalities. So for us, it's been always important in our practice to engage urban conflict as a creative tool. In fact, to elevate the border region where we live and work as a site of urban and political creativity. We many times in witnessing this wall, the US-Mexico border wall, we say the wall exists only to be transgressed. And isn't that the ultimate aspiration of art and culture? To transgress our own fears, our own conventions, our own cliches. And I think this is very important today because border walls are being constructed everywhere in the world as a physical manifestation of our fear of the other who does not look like us. And I think that this has important implications in the construction of the physical city out of urbanizations of exclusion and marginalization and urbanization of surveillance. So when this wall, after traveling miles and miles of the Tijuana territory, finally sinks into the Pacific Ocean, we witness an incredibly strange image, both poetic somehow, but hugely tragic, as this place is what emblematizes one of the greatest conflicts in today's world, the conflict between the political and the natural. At a larger scale, I think, this is what defines our border region, the conflict between ecological, transnational, regional systems and the stupidity of imposed administrative borders. This is the binational watershed system between San Diego and Tijuana, the natural hydrological system at the border that is truncated by the US-Mexico wall. 25% of it is in San Diego, 75% in Tijuana. Both cities do not collaborate in managing these resources. And at the end of that huge natural system, we find the two marginalized neighborhoods that we have been engaging in the last decade and a half. Two communities on both sides of the checkpoint. To the north, San Isidro, which is the first immigrant neighborhood north of the checkpoint, and to the south, an informal settlement of Laureles, home to 85,000 people. The last slum of Latin America, literally crashing against the US-Mexico border wall. And in between them, the tip end of that binational watershed system, the Tijuana River estuary, which now has been overlaid with militarization by Homeland Security after 9/11. These are the characters that really animate our own strategies locally. In San Isidro, the first immigrant neighborhood into the United States becomes a point of entry into so many other marginalized communities, not only in our region, but around the world, understanding, investigating the positive impact of immigrants in the transformation of the American neighborhood or the city at large, out of strategies of adaptation and resilience. We are interested in trying to measure, visualize the many bottom-up, informal urban dynamics in marginalized immigrant communities, trying to visualize them and politically represent them in order to transform top-down urban policy. We find that in immigrant communities, in other words, we can possibly research the DNA for a more complex social and economic sustainable local urbanization. And to the south, in Laureles Canyon, is a point of entry into many informal settlements across the world. But here is very interesting because this informal settlement builds itself with the waste of San Diego. So the slum as a laboratory for reimagining housing and environmental infrastructure. So as we get deeper into this specificity, we are very much interested in the specificity of the political to reimagine global dynamics. So at this very juncture, where the slum of Laureles, 85,000 people, crashes literally against the border wall, and in the distance we find the estuary on the US side in the militarization of Homeland Security, we see here the conflict between these two environments that are barely a few meters away from each other. So the conflict between informal urbanization, environmental systems, and militarization is what mobilizes much of our research at this very juncture. And after the building of the second and now third border wall, we realize how this artifact, this wall, is only exacerbating environmental insecurity as it has intensified the flow of waste from the slum into the natural protected land. So we are not only interested in localizing the global by entering into the specificity of this political condition, but also to understand that from this vantage point, we can also see how these conditions are reproduced, obviously, everywhere in the world, whether it is at the wall of Ceuta and Melilla, the fortress Europe at this moment, or the Israeli-Palestinian border. And this is when we began to realize, that at this point, we find how the world's most contested border checkpoints are clustered along the same global corridor between 30 and 38 degrees north parallel, linking Tijuana, San Diego, the most intensified funnel of migration from Latin America into the United States, Fortress Europe, not only at Ceuta and Melilla, but now stretched along the Strait of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, the Israeli-Palestinian border, and even including India and Kashmir, and South and North Korea to the east, obviously including the South Chinese Sea, which is really a contested territory in terms of jurisdictional power. This is what we called the political equator, which in fact became for us a curatorial project to enter into a series of debates and dialogues within geographies of conflict to reorganize our conversation. So we began to curate a series of meetings called the Political Equator meetings, bringing artists, cultural producers, politicians, activists from different places of conflict in the world to converge in this border region and occupy these environments of conflict, in this case between the informal settlement, Homeland Security, the estuary, and the border itself. The last Political Equator meeting, we requested a special permission from Homeland Security to transform a border drain recently built into an official port of entry from the United States into Mexico, so that the public who came to the event crossed uninterrupted from the estuary in San Diego into the slum in Tijuana as basically Mexican immigration waited for us in the south end of the drain to stamp our passports. So for 24 hours, we erased the border just to bring awareness, to visualize this very particular, again, site of conflict. Here's where we are in line with our passports, crossing from San Diego into Mexico. Homeland Security allowed us to do this only if Mexican immigration would wait for us in the south end of the drain to stamp our passports. But as Mexican immigration is stamping our passports, people are able to witness how the sewer, how the contamination from the slum enters into San Diego after the construction of this new artifact. So politicians, activists were with us. And at this very moment, we actually begin to open up a question. Is there a cross-border citizen? Can citizenship be based on common interests and aspirations and not on national identitarian politics? This has been a fundamental question for our practice in the last years. Is there a cross-border citizen whose conception of citizen is less dominated by the imposition of the nation-state or the arbitrariness of jurisdictional boundaries, but more organized around shared values across two divided, contested cities? This is where we began to go beyond our locality, and we went to look for other cities in the world that had redefined themselves by using citizenship as an integrated tool and not a divisive one, us versus them. So we went to Latin America, where we believe we can find some of the most exemplary models of urban transformation out of social justice. In fact, we have been witnessing that both in Europe and the United States, we see the dominant model of austerity, a withdrawal of public investment into social programs and public spaces and infrastructure. And in Latin America, we find that there is an incredible resurgence of public thinking and investment. The two cities that became exemplary for us in our research are located in Colombia, Bogota and Medellin. As many of you might know, Bogota, in fact, in the mid-90s, was the most dangerous city in the world. Rampant violence because of, obviously, the drug cartels, huge inequality in dysfunctional institutions, huge urban violence. In the mid-90s, the philosopher turned mayor, Antanas Mockus, in order to fight and confront inequality and violence, he did not come with tanks and guns. He came instead with clowns and with a new vision of how to transform the hearts and minds of citizens. In his first weeks as a mayor, he distributed placards across the citizenry with the thumbs either up or down so that people would begin to self-regulate, find each other, try to engage their reciprocal expectations, mutual responsibility. So when somebody would see somebody on the streets committing an act that would undermine civility, they would show the thumbs down. Or when somebody was actually doing a good deed to elevate civic perceptions, they would show the thumbs up. Many people thought that this was a silly exercise, but incrementally it allowed people to begin to see each other and to understand that the survival of the individual today depends on the health of the collective. It's about mutual reciprocal expectations. This is what Antanas Mockus called the necessary construction of a new citizenship culture. What Antanas is known around the world is because he really began to create new strategies of intervention into social norms, to construct new forms of community and civic engagement, participatory urbanization. The city becomes a classroom where urban pedagogy visualizes and engages these citizens. So the civic lessons that we took from Bogota are three. Before transforming the city physically, we must transform social norms and behaviors, mutual expectations and accountability. It's better to fight violence with community processes rather than law and order. And finally, that arts and culture are engines for civic engagement. After Antanas finished his 2 terms as mayor, he founded a non-profit organization called Corpo Visionarios and constructed an incredible tool called the Citizenship Culture Survey, which in fact measures vertical relationships of trust or not between institutions and citizens, and horizontal relationships across different sectors. The capacity of the city to self-coordinate across institutions. And he deployed this survey across 50 plus Latin American cities, commissioned by municipalities, because the results of the survey visualize the zones of vulnerability in public policy, so that the municipality could reorient its spending to tackle those issues. So this became a script for urban intervention. We brought Antanas Mockus to the border recently to collaborate with those in a special project at the border. Here he is looking at the border wall, wondering what the hell this is, because he again reminded us that in Colombia, in Bogota, citizenship was really used as an integrative tool, not a divisive one. And so we began to work on what we ended up calling the cross-border citizenship culture survey between not one city, but between two that are divided, to find out that there were regional, trans-border, cross-border sensibilities that really enable us to understand shared values and interests. For us, it has been important in our practice to become facilitators of new cross-sector collaborations and dialogues across government, civil society, university, private sector. Here we are acting as facilitators of a conversation between the mayor of Tijuana and Antanas Mockus. There is much to say about this survey. There is no time, of course, in this brief presentation, but suffices to say that the data is a critical mirror between these two cities. And one particular finding was important to us, that most of San Diegans, 70% of San Diegans, can say that they can trust people from Mexico, which is completely a different narrative from what we've been hearing from the 45th president. In Medellin, we began to collaborate with Sergio Fajardo, another progressive mayor, who in fact, being a mathematician, he became mayor. It's this very interesting phenomenon in Latin America, these theories and academics really transforming the political itself. So Sergio Fajardo was a lot more powerful because in the way he said, he called the problem for its name. The root of violence is inequality. How do we tackle inequality? A political position, we need to confront it and we cannot do it alone. It has to be a cross-sector effort. And as many of you know, Medellin became famous because as no other place in the world, there was a civic conversation, a collective way of investing in the poorest, most marginalized zones of the city, rethinking the city itself from its periphery. So when Winnie Mas was talking today about connectivity, I agree with that. But we also need to ask, what are we connecting? And I think that in Bogota, in Medellin, it was important that for them, it was about linking poverty and wealth, creating new points of access into opportunity and possibility. In other words, reinventing government as collaborative and inclusive. The question and the possibility of co-producing the city with others, with communities. We spoke to Sergio Fajardo and the former planner of Medellin, Alejandro Echeverri. We began to collaborate in a project that we call the Medellin Diagram. Because many magazines around the world were just publishing the photos of the pretty buildings. But nobody was talking about the institutional transformation that made Medellin possible. So we proposed a project where we would begin to visualize the political and civic processes. It's an institutional project today. It's a political project that reimagines and reorganizes institutional protocols, social and economic relations. So here are my this is my sketchbook. We interviewed 40 plus people across the city, from social workers, artists, philanthropists to government, trying to piece together a series of concepts that would give us a clue as of what happened in Medellin. Again, it's too much to share with you in a brief time here, but in our table of concepts, again, it's enough at this moment to say that there were three areas that we found of very compelling intervention in Medellin. One, they confronted inequality and they summoned a new civic conversation to tackle it. Two, they designed new governance. They intervene in bureaucracy itself to make it more inclusive and collaborative. And finally, they spatialize citizenship by investing in public space, not as a space of beautification and leisure, but as a space of knowledge construction, the construction of a new type of citizenship. And there are many concepts that emerge. Let me share three quick concepts to really understand what the project is about. It's diagrams. One of them is mediating top-down and bottom-up, something that Medellin did so well was convening top-down institutions, government, civic philanthropy, foundations, universities, industry, and bottom-up agencies, grassroots organizations, civic groups. How to curate the meeting of formal and informal capacities. So what they were effectively doing, they were designing mediation across divided sectors. And so doing, really approximating their knowledges and capacities. So the meeting, again, of top-down and bottom-up suggested a very important concept. Can, in fact, we co-produce public policy with communities, with their aspirations, their imagination, their practices? This was fundamental to energize a new type of bureaucratic project that really was a lot more open and inclusive. The mayor's office was transformed into an urban think tank to facilitate the interface between institutions and civil society. Second, redistribute knowledges and resources. They said, obviously, that fragmented institutions fragment the city. So one first task for this visionary mayor was how, again, to enable the convening of summoning of institutions to collaborate. The fragmented institutions, their knowledges and resources, how to summon them, to begin to centralize and integrate, again, their capacities, knowledges, and resources. But what is interesting is that while they are centralizing and trying to visualize these knowledges and resources, it was only to redistribute them to sites of marginalization and poverty. So one major concept, again, in the Medellin Diagram, which I think is probably one of the most important ones, is an incredible idea of centralizing and decentralizing knowledges and resources simultaneously. Finally, public space educates. For Medellin, in the library parks project, was an incredible model to reimagine public space and how it can perform. Again, beginning with the convening of diverse sectors, because they believe that the transformation of the city is not really in the hands of only one sector. It's about a shared responsibility for public works. So they summon nonprofits, community, activists, arts groups, cultural producers, universities, civic philanthropy, government, private sector. And they began to create coalitions across them to co-produce cultural programming with communities. So for them, it was not just a matter of designing beautiful public physical spaces. They were also injecting into those spaces very specific programs to make sure that funding was available in the long term, maintenance across, again, these coalitions, management, most of governance at the local scale, and finally, a very complex curatorial project to assure that the cultural programming responded to community needs. So the designing of public spaces and programs simultaneously is an incredible concept in Medellin. Obviously, what I am suggesting here is that the future of global governance depends today on the leadership of municipalities, progressive municipalities, a sort of a new cosmopolitan municipal project. But this lesson that public space needs to be equipped with tools to build community capacity for political action is what we brought back to the border, to create a project that we call the cross-border community stations, which argues that universities and communities can be meaningful partners in tackling poverty and climate change. So this became the cross-border community stations, again, understanding that both universities and communities have knowledges and resources to contribute. So in other words, we're trying to link the specialized knowledge of universities with the creative intelligence of the bottom-up of communities. And I wanted to include Fonna Forman's voice in trying to explain a couple of concepts about this, moving from the vertical to the horizontal.
It's been difficult at times to convince the university that working with marginalized communities is something other than charity or humanitarian assistance. Universities often see themselves in a vertical relation, particularly with marginalized communities, that we have all of the knowledge and resources and the communities are sort of empty vessels waiting to be filled with our knowledge. We've been working very hard to tip that relationship to a horizontal plane, where the university and community are partnering in the production of new knowledge and solutions to persistent problems. So one thing that we've been able to bring to the partnership is the ability to help communities leverage university resources to become developers of their own projects. So it's not about the university coming to the rescue. It's about empowering communities and using resources that the university has to leverage new opportunities.
One discipline cannot tackle the crisis alone.
One of our key agendas is to help students learn the tools necessary for communicating across disciplinary barriers and disciplinary languages. Universities are divided up into little fiefdoms, little silos. And oftentimes, as students professionalize and progress in their degrees, they lose the ability to see the place of their discipline within a larger structure of disciplines. So all of the programs that we lead are really teaching students to be the innovators, to be the change makers in the next generation. People will have to learn how to solve problems that are multifaceted. Problems of poverty, inequality cannot be solved by one discipline alone, even though universities are structured that way.
So in essence, this project, learning from Latin America and trying to transform our own university into producing new forms of research and knowledge, became effectively a collaborative education and research platform, a knowledge exchange platform, as we were convening also a variety of sectors to collaborate. But what we discovered recently is that this is not only a programmatic project, but also became a model for shared urban intervention, as we discovered that both the community and the university can be co-developers of housing and public space. How to leverage the economic power of the university is programmatic agenda as equity for communities to be developers themselves of their own forms of urbanization. So we began to partner with a variety of nonprofit organizations and created a network across the border. Field stations. The community stations basically are field hubs located in marginalized neighborhoods on both sides of the border, where teaching and research is conducted collaboratively between activists, researchers in the university, community, nonprofit organizations, and so on. So it was a way for us to return to these two marginalized neighborhoods I began today with. The two cross-border community stations are grounded and rooted in those environments in collaboration with two nonprofit organizations. And to finish, just to give an example of what each of those community stations is doing in the slum, in the informal settlement of Laureles, we are negotiating with the local municipality in Tijuana to give us access to a series of slivers of public lands in that slum to argue for understanding the estuary to the north and the informal settlement as a continuous system, as to elevate strategies of interdependence, that the poor slum can be the protector of the rich estuary. And we are trying to really engage some of these sites, again, along this informal settlement, transforming them into public spaces that act as knowledge, sort of pedagogical nodes, but double as water and waste management infrastructure in order to prevent the waste from reaching our precious binational asset. And in one of those slivers is where we are locating our community station in Tijuana, which is maybe the most complex of many of our projects, which is a multi-layered system of open public spaces with different programs from our university, understanding architecture as a pedagogical tool that can reflect and resonate and visualize the many dynamic temporal processes that happen in these informal settlements. But what is interesting, and this is sort of the message I wanted to share or contribute to the debate here, is that it's not enough just to design the physical systems. Medellin has taught us that we also need to design the protocols. We need to design the forms of local governance, the forms of economic sustainability, the complexity of programmatic sort of agendas, the institutional protocols, so that our university rethinks itself by triangulating with activists, bringing the knowledge of activists into the rethinking of education. Very complex set of relations. Many times I've said that the future of the city today depends less on buildings and more on the reconfiguration of social and economic relations. And that's something that architects, I think, can contribute with. I want to finish with this image because this community station in this informal settlement has been also a way of engaging Tijuana as a city of factories. Because next to these slums, we find multinationals, mainly from Asia, coming here to take advantage of cheap labor in those slums. But as I mentioned earlier, next to these factories, we also see an incredibly emergent urbanization that builds itself with the waste of the other, with the urban debris of San Diego, recycling houses. The post-war bungalows from the old suburbs of San Diego are brought into Tijuana. The transformation of tires into complex systems that are intertwined to produce a more efficient retaining walls. Garage doors from many of the houses in Southern California become now the skin for new social housing. So this incredible creative intelligence in transforming systems, recycling into new forms of infrastructure is important. But then we decided to enter into the factory, declaring it a site of intervention, so that bringing accountability for those factories to invest in those communities from which they borrow cheap labor. This is a factory that we began to negotiate with from Spain called Mecalux, who fabricates lightweight metal pallet racks. We talked to the president. We said plainly, as factories benefit from the cheap labor around them, can the material systems of the factories be a way of reciprocating by adapting their design into new systems for informal housing? So effectively, we entered into the factory to simply adapt and reimagine what we could do with many of those materials to produce the types of frameworks to help sustain and structure the recycling of waste, which is ultimately very dangerous at times, and these houses lack infrastructure. So the president of the factory was game. He decided to collaborate. He said, let's intervene into the catalog, and we basically worked together to adapt the DNA of the factory, which is this pallet rack system, which you find in any warehouse in the world, adapting it slightly in order to maintain its economy, which has changed the detail of the base in order to tilt the column and let the rest of the system work the way it works, to produce basically a framework that could be adaptable to in the recycling of waste in those slums. Here's one of the most successful moments in our practice. We are inside the factory. We believe that the task of the architect today is to infiltrate into institutions, to reorganize and redirect surplus value to communities in need. And here we are trying to assemble with them the first prototype for this infrastructure, again, that we are deploying in the slum in collaboration with community activists to support the informal evolution of housing in that environment. In essence, it is really an infrastructure that is adaptable and that can be used to retrofit existing environments across this informal settlement. This is part of a research that has been ongoing in our practice, again, understanding informal settlements as incredible laboratories for thinking of how to temporalize a space, how to really learn from the temporal evolutionary processes of the informal, but how do we inject acupunctural infrastructure to frame and anticipate that transformation? To finish, I wanted to say this is one of the most important projects, I think, for many of us working on sites of marginalization, that in order to make a claim for the democratization of urbanization, we need today to mediate top-down and bottom-up. How to link top-down resources in support of bottom-up intelligence and creativity. This, I think, is probably one of the main ingredients in the possibility of shaping primarily today a new public imagination. Thank you very much.